They almost won. The side that lost, they came within hours of a different outcome. Here is how close it really was. Imagine a single ship sitting in the middle of a narrow stretch of blue water. This ship is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. It is one of the most powerful things humans have ever built for the ocean. It costs about $2 billion to put one in the water. It is packed with computers, radars, and enough missiles to level a small city. This ship is designed to fight a world war. It is built to track 100 targets at once and shoot them out of the sky from miles away. But right now, this billion-dollar beast is in a very uncomfortable place. It is sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. This is a tiny strip of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. At its narrowest point, the shipping lane is only about 2 miles wide. Think about that for a second. A massive warship is squeezed into a space smaller than a typical airport runway. On one side, you have the rugged coastline of Iran. On the other side, you have the rocky islands of Oman. This isn't the open ocean where you can see for miles and turn whenever you want. This is a hallway. And in this hallway, the rules of naval warfare start to change. Every day, about 1/5 of the world's oil passes through this specific spot. If the water stops flowing here, the global economy starts to break. Gas prices go up, factories stop, countries panic. Because of this, the United States Navy keeps ships here to make sure the gate stays open. Usually, these ships travel in a group called a carrier strike group. They have a giant aircraft carrier in the middle and several destroyers protecting it. It is a floating fortress that no one wants to mess with. But sometimes, a single destroyer has to make the trip alone. Maybe the carrier is busy somewhere else. Maybe the Navy wants to show that one ship is enough to keep the peace. So, the destroyer sails alone. The crew is on high alert. They know that just a few miles away, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is watching them. Iran knows it cannot build a $2 billion destroyer to match the Americans. They don't even try. Instead, they spent 40 years figuring out how to kill one. They realized that if you can't build a bigger shield, you just need a lot of cheap spears. That is where the fast boats come in. These aren't warships in the traditional sense. They are small, made of fiberglass, and powered by massive outboard motors. They look more like something you would use for a weekend at the lake than a tool for war. But they are painted a dull gray. They carry heavy machine guns and rocket launchers. Some of them carry high-speed torpedoes or anti-ship missiles. Some of them are just filled with explosives and designed to be piloted by someone who doesn't plan on coming home. A single one of these boats is a nuisance. The destroyer could sink it in seconds without the captain even getting out of his chair. But the Iranians don't send one. They have hundreds of them hidden in caves and tunnels along the coast. They practice something called swarming. It is the same way 1,000 bees can kill a much larger animal. The animal can kill 10 bees, or 50, or even 100. But eventually, the bees find a way through. For years, this has been the ultimate what-if for naval planners. What happens when the world's most advanced ship meets 15 of these low-tech boats? On this day, the sun is high and the water is flat like a mirror. The crew on the destroyer can see the Iranian coast clearly. They see the small dots on the radar moving near the shore. This is normal. The boats always come out to watch the Americans pass. They usually buzz around, take some photos, and then go home. But today, the dots aren't staying near the shore. They are turning. They are picking up speed. And they are all heading for the same point in the middle of the hallway. The lone destroyer is about to find out if $2 billion is enough to survive $1,000 worth of fiberglass. Everything changed at 10:14 in the morning. Until that second, it was just another Tuesday in the Persian Gulf. The sun was hot. The air was thick with salt and humidity. Inside the ship, it was cool and dark. The crew in the combat center sat in front of glowing blue screens. They watched the 15 dots on the radar. For 20 minutes, those dots had been staying exactly 5 miles away. They were moving at the same speed as the destroyer. This is what the Iranian boats usually do. They show the Americans that they are being watched. It is a game of nerves. But at 10:14, the game stopped. The 15 dots didn't just speed up. They turned inward. They stopped shadowing the ship and started intersecting it. On the radar, it looked like a fan closing shut, The officer in charge called out the change immediately. The speed of the boats jumped from 20 knots to 45 knots. That is over 50 miles per hour on the water. At that speed, the distance between the boats and the destroyer was disappearing fast. The captain was called to the center of the ship. He had a choice to make that would define the rest of his life. In the Navy, they call this the rules of engagement. It is a thick book of laws that tells a captain when he is allowed to kill people. If he fires too early, he starts a world war. If he fires too late, his ship and his crew end up at the bottom of the ocean. The destroyer began broadcasting warnings over the radio. They used English. They used Farsi. They told the boats to turn away or they would be fired upon. There was no answer. The boats didn't slow down. In fact, they began to spread out even further. They weren't coming from one direction anymore. They were surrounding the ship. 3 boats were coming straight for the front. 4 were aiming for the back. The rest were splitting off to the left and right. This was the swarm. This was the moment the what if became what now. The destroyer is built to fight high-altitude bombers and nuclear submarines. Its main weapon is a vertical launching system with 96 missile cells. These missiles are designed to hit targets 100 miles away. But the boats were now only 2 miles away. The big missiles were useless. It is like trying to use a sniper rifle to kill a swarm of flies in your kitchen. The ship has smaller guns, too. There is a big 5-inch gun on the front deck. There are 2 smaller cannons on the sides. And there are heavy machine guns manned by sailors in life jackets. But the ship only has so many eyes. The computer system, as advanced as it is, can only track so many small, fast-moving targets at such close range. Waves and sea spray make it hard for the radar to see clearly. The captain gave the order to sound the alarm. The bells rang throughout the ship. Sailors who were eating breakfast or sleeping in their bunks ran to their battle stations. They closed the heavy steel doors to seal the ship into compartments. They knew what was coming. At 1 mile away, the lead boat did something that changed everything. It didn't fire a missile. It didn't launch a torpedo. It simply crossed a line on the water that the captain had drawn in his mind. The captain looked at his screen. The boats were now less than 60 seconds from impact. He didn't wait for a signal from Washington. He didn't ask for permission. He gave the order to open fire. The big 5-inch gun on the deck let out a roar that shook the entire ship. A massive shell flew across the water and hit the lead boat directly. The small fiberglass craft didn't just sink, it vanished in a ball of orange fire and black smoke. For a heartbeat, there was silence on the radio. Then, the other 14 boats did something the Americans didn't expect. They didn't turn around. They didn't run away. They pushed the throttles forward and began to zigzag. The ocean was about to become a very violent place. The lone destroyer was no longer a symbol of power. It was a target. The fire from the first boat did not stop the attack. It acted like a signal. The remaining 14 boats did not hesitate. They did not slow down to see who had survived. They pushed their throttles to the wall and split apart. The ocean behind them turned white with the wake of their engines. On the bridge of the destroyer, the captain saw his world shrink. A few minutes ago, he was worried about miles of ocean. Now, he was worried about yards. The ship's computer system is called Aegis. It is named after the shield of the Greek gods. It is arguably the most advanced brain ever put into a machine of war. But Aegis was built to look up at the sky. It was designed to find missiles moving at thousands of miles per hour in the thin air. Down here, on the surface of the water, things were much more difficult. The waves were creating clutter on the radar screens. The spray from the fast boats made it hard for the sensors to stay locked on. The computer was trying to track 14 different targets, moving in 14 different directions. The big 5-inch gun on the front of the ship fired again. It missed. The shell hit the water and sent a massive plume of white spray into the air. The boats were zigzagging, too fast for the heavy turret to keep up. The big gun was designed to hit other ships or targets on the land. It was not designed to hit a fiberglass boat the size of a pickup truck. As the boats closed to within half a mile, the ship's automatic defenses took over. These are the phalanx close-in weapon systems. Sailors call them Sea Whiz or R2-D2 because they look like little white robots. They are massive Gatling guns. that can fire 4,500 rounds in a single minute. One of the guns turned toward the closest boat on the right side of the ship. It let out a sound that didn't even sound like a gun. It sounded like a giant metal zipper being pulled open across the sky. A stream of red tracer bullets poured into the water. The fast boat was caught in the middle of a turn. The heavy bullets shredded the fiberglass hull like it was made of paper. The engine on the back of the boat exploded into a ball of white steam. The boat flipped over and was swallowed by its own wake. 13 boats left, but while the phalanx gun was busy on the right, 3 boats were closing in on the left. The ship has a limited number of these automatic guns. They can only fire at one thing at a time. This is the math of the swarm. If you have more targets than the ship has guns, someone is going to get through. The captain knew this. He gave the order for the human gunners to open fire. On the sides of the ship, sailors were standing behind heavy machine guns. They were wearing helmets and thick vests. They were looking through iron sights at targets that were now only a few hundred yards away. The noise became deafening. The air smelled like burnt gunpowder and diesel fuel. The sailors were firing at anything that moved on the water. They could see the Iranian crews on the boats. They could see the rocket-propelled grenades being held by the men in the small crafts. One Iranian boat fired a shoulder-launched missile. It streaked across the water and hit the side of the destroyer. It didn't sink the ship. The destroyer's made of heavy steel, and a small rocket is like a bee sting to a giant. But the explosion blew out the lights in one part of the ship. It started a fire near the lifeboats. It created smoke that made it even harder for the gunners to see. Then, the center boat in the formation did something different. It wasn't firing a gun. It wasn't zigzagging. It was a special kind of boat used by the Revolutionary Guard. It was packed with hundreds of pounds of high-grade explosives. The driver was not trying to survive. He was aiming for the very center of the destroyer. The gunners on the deck saw it coming. They poured bullets into the front of the boat. They saw the fiberglass splinter. They saw the driver slump over the steering wheel. But the boat didn't stop. The throttle was locked in place. The boat hit the side of the billion-dollar ship at 50 miles per hour. The explosion was not a bee sting. It was a hammer blow. The force of the blast lifted the front of the destroyer out of the water. A massive hole opened up just above the waterline. The ocean began to pour into the ship. The unsinkable fortress was suddenly very vulnerable, and there were still 12 boats circling in the smoke. The fight was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the next 5 minutes. We usually think that more money means more safety. In the world of the Navy, that is often true. The United States spends more on its ships than almost anyone else. The destroyer has the best sensors ever made. It has the most expensive missiles ever built. But in the middle of a swarm attack, all that money starts to work against the ship. To understand why, you have to look at how these weapons were designed to work. A modern Navy missile is a masterpiece of engineering. It can fly for over 100 miles. It can find a single enemy jet moving through the clouds at twice the speed of sound. It can hit that jet with the precision of a surgeon. But each of those missiles costs about $2 million. And the destroyer only carries a limited number of them. Once they are gone, you cannot just reload them at sea. You have to go back to a special port with a giant crane. Now look at the boats coming at the ship. They are made of fiberglass. They cost maybe $10,000 or $20,000. The engines are the same ones you might see on a high-speed fishing boat. The hull is small and sits very low in the water. This creates a massive problem for the ship's brain. The ship's radar works by bouncing radio waves off of metal. It is very good at seeing a giant steel bomber in the clear sky. It is very bad at seeing a small piece of plastic bouncing on the waves. The waves themselves reflect the radar waves. This creates what the sailors call clutter. On the screen, it looks like static on an old television. The computer has to work incredibly hard to tell the difference between a whitecap and an enemy boat. Then there is the problem of the horizon. Because the Earth is curved, the radar can only see things that are in a straight line. If an enemy plane is high in the sky, the ship can see it coming from 100 miles away. But a fast boat is only a few feet tall. It stays hidden behind the curve of the ocean until it is very close. By the time the radar can actually lock onto the boat, it is already inside the danger zone. But the biggest problem is the math of the trade. Let's say the ship uses its best missiles to stop the boats. It fires one $2 million missile to kill one $10,000 boat. The Navy is winning the battle, but they are losing the war. If the Iranians send 50 boats, the ship might use up half of its missiles. And that is exactly what the enemy wants. They want the destroyer to empty its magazines on cheap targets, because once the ship is out of missiles, it is just a big target. That is when the real threat comes in. That is when the heavy anti-ship missiles are launched from trucks on the shore. The destroyer would be like a boxer who spent all his energy hitting a punching bag before the real fight even started. This is what military punching experts call asymmetry. It means the two sides are playing completely different games. The Americans are playing a game of quality. The Iranians are playing a game of quantity. And in a narrow hallway like the Strait of Hormuz, quantity has a quality all its own. The ship is designed to survive a high-tech war. It is not designed to survive a low-tech swarm. The armor on the ship is thin to keep it fast. It relies on its guns and its electronics to keep things from touching the hull. But as the water pours through the hole in the side of the ship, the crew realizes something terrifying. The high-tech shield has been broken by a low-tech hammer. The ship is now slowing down. The computers are starting to flicker and fail as the salt water hits the electrical lines. The 15 boats were never meant to sink the ship by themselves. They were meant to open the door. And now, the door is wide open. The explosion on the side of the ship was the loudest sound the crew had ever heard. It was not just a noise. It was a physical wave that threw men across the deck and slammed them into steel walls. It felt like the entire world had been cracked open from the inside out. Inside the ship, the lights flickered and then died. In the combat center, the blue screens went black for 5 long seconds. For 5 seconds, the most advanced ship in the world was blind. When the screens finally blinked back on, the battle had changed. It was no longer a high-tech war of sensors and long-range missiles. It had become a street fight on the water. The remaining 12 boats did not stop to celebrate. They saw the black smoke rising from the side of the destroyer, and they knew they had a chance. The giant was bleeding. The Iranian boats began to close the distance even more. They were now so close that the ship's big guns could not point low enough to hit them. In naval warfare, this is called the dead zone. It is the space right next to the hull where the heavy weapons are physically blocked by the ship itself. The only thing left to protect the ship were the individual sailors and their handheld guns. Men stood on the edges of the ship, looking straight down into the water. They were not looking at radar screens anymore. They were looking at the eyes of the men in the boats. The Iranians were firing rocket-propelled grenades at the bridge of the ship. They were trying to kill the people who were steering. Small bullets pinged against the steel walls like hail on a tin roof. On the deck, it was pure chaos. The smoke from the fires was thick, greasy, and black. It blinded the automatic cameras that the computers used to aim the guns. It choked the sailors who were trying to breathe through their heavy masks. The destroyer was still moving, but it was starting to lean to one side. The ocean was pouring into the hull at thousands of gallons per minute. The ship was getting heavy. It was getting slow. The captain was shouting orders over a radio that was crackling with static. He needed to get his ship out of the narrow channel and into deeper water. But there were boats in front of him, there were boats behind him, and on the horizon, the lookouts saw something even worse. They saw more white wakes coming from the Iranian coast. The first 15 boats were just the start. Another swarm was launching from the hidden tunnels on the shore. The ship was trapped in a box made of its own smoke and the narrow walls of the strait. Every time the sailors managed to sink one boat, another one seemed to take its place. The water around the ship was covered in burning oil and floating debris. It did not look like the modern Navy anymore. It looked like a scene from an old movie about wooden ships and pirates. But the stakes were much higher than a movie. If this ship sank, it would not just be a tragedy for the families of the crew. It would be the end of an era. For 70 years, the world believed that a large American ship was untouchable. That myth was dying in the mud of the Persian Gulf. The crew had to make a choice. In the next 60 seconds, they could focus on fighting the boats, or they could focus on saving the ship. From sinking, they could not do both, and the second swarm was getting closer. A warship is not a single piece of metal. It is a living thing made of millions of parts. It is miles of copper wire. It is thousands of steel pipes. It is a complex web of computers that talk to each other every millisecond. When the suicide boat hit the side of the ship, it did more than just blow a hole in the steel. It sent a shockwave through the entire nervous system of the ship. Imagine a human being getting hit in the ribs with a sledgehammer. Even if the skin doesn't break, the organs inside start to fail. That is what was happening to the destroyer. The explosion happened right near one of the ship's main electrical hubs. In a modern ship, electricity is everything. It is the air conditioning that keeps the computers cool. It is the pumps that keep the fuel moving to the engines. It is the motors that turn the heavy gun turrets. When the saltwater hit those electrical lines, didn't just cause a spark. It caused a massive short circuit that began to race through the ship. In the dark hallways below the deck, sailors saw blue sparks jumping from the walls. The smell of ozone and burning plastic filled the air. And then the most terrifying thing happened. The ship went quiet. The hum of the engines, a sound the sailors hear every second of their lives, simply stopped. The ship was still moving because of its own weight, but it was no longer pushing forward. It was drifting. This is the nightmare of every captain. A dead ship in a narrow channel is just a very expensive target. The water pouring into the hull was heavy. Every gallon of seawater weighs about 8 pounds. In the first minute, thousands of gallons had already entered the ship. The destroyer began to tilt to the left. As the ship tilted, the guns on the deck became useless. The computer that tells the guns where to point was trying to compensate for the tilt, but the motors were moving too slowly because of the power loss. The automatic Sea Whiz guns were now pointing at the sky or into the waves. The shield was gone. Below the deck, the crew was fighting a war that no one on the outside could see. They were standing waist-deep in oily black water. They were trying to use heavy wooden beams to plug the hole. They were trying to keep the water from reaching the ammunition rooms. If the water touched the missiles in the vertical launch tubes, the ship could explode from the inside. This is the reality of modern naval combat that the movies don't show. It isn't just about who has the biggest missiles. It is about who can fix a pipe in the dark while the room is filling with water. The Iranians saw the ship slow down. They saw the black smoke stop coming from the funnels and start coming from the side. They knew they had done it. They had turned a $2 billion weapon into a floating rock. The second swarm was now only minutes away. The destroyer was alone, leaning over, and silent. The sailors on the deck were still firing their machine guns, but they were running low on bullets. They were looking at the horizon, hoping to see a friendly plane or another ship. But the Strait of Hormuz is a lonely place when you are losing. The captain stood on the bridge and looked at his dead screens. He knew that if he couldn't get the power back on in the next 3 minutes, the ship was lost. Not because it would sink, but because it couldn't fight back. The weight of the water was dragging the ship down, but the weight of the silence was even worse. No one was coming to save them. That was the realization that began to sink in as the minutes ticked by. In the movies, when a ship gets into trouble, a fleet of jets appears over the horizon just in time. But the real world is much bigger and much slower than the movies. The rest of the American fleet was hundreds of miles away. The aircraft carrier was sitting in the Arabian Sea, far on the other side of the mountains of Oman. Even at full speed, it would take hours for another ship to reach this spot, and the jets were not sitting on the runway with their engines running. It takes time to launch a strike force. It takes time to fly across an international border. On the bridge of the destroyer, the radio operator was desperately trying to send a message. And it takes time to find a single ship in a sea filled with smoke and chaos. But the antennas on the top of the ship had been shredded by machine gun fire and shrapnel. The satellite dish that connects the ship to the Pentagon was pointing at the water instead of the sky. The ship was tilting too far to keep a lock on the signal. They were screaming into a void. They managed to get out one short, garbled emergency signal before the power failed again. Back in Washington and at the regional headquarters in Bahrain, the screens went red. They knew something was wrong. They saw the ship's position stop moving on the GPS. They heard the sound of explosions over the open radio channel. But they didn't know exactly what they were looking at. They didn't know if it was an accident, a small skirmish, or the start of a war. While the generals were arguing over what to do, the second swarm arrived. The lookouts on the deck saw them first. It wasn't 15 boats this time. It was 20. And these weren't just the small fiberglass boats they had fought before. In the middle of this group were larger patrol crafts. These boats were made of steel. They carried heavy anti-ship missiles that could fly for 20 miles. They didn't need to get close to the ship to kill it. The Iranian commander on the shore had seen the first attack succeed. He knew the destroyer was sitting still. He knew it was leaning over. He gave the order to finish the job. He knew the big guns were silent. On the deck of the destroyer, the sailors looked at the horizon and saw the white streaks of missiles launching. These were not rocket-propelled grenades. These were heavy weapons designed to sink ships 3 times the size of a destroyer. The sailors had no automatic guns left to shoot them down. They had no electronic jammers to trick the missiles into missing. They were standing on a floating target with nothing but their rifles. One of the young sailors later said it felt like standing on a train track and watching the headlight of the engine coming toward you. You know exactly what is going to happen, and there is nowhere to run. The first missile hit the back of the ship where the helicopter deck is located. The explosion turned the entire rear of the vessel into a twisted mess of orange fire. The second missile hit the bridge, the place where the captain and his officers were trying to save the ship. Simply ceased to exist. The destroyer was no longer a warship. It was a burning wreck. And the message that finally reached the rest of the U.S. Navy was just 4 words long. They did not make it. The world was about to wake up to a morning where everything they knew about power was wrong. The frantic calls for help had been answered by silence, and now the silence was all that was left. The images of the ship sinking did not come from a news crew. They came from the phones of the Iranian sailors. The videos were blurry and shaky, but they showed something the world thought was impossible. They showed the pride of the American Navy sliding under the waves. Within 2 hours, those videos had been seen by over 1 billion people. The myth of the untouchable ship was gone. In the halls of the Pentagon, the lights stayed on all night. They weren't just planning a rescue. They were realizing that their entire way of fighting was now obsolete. For a century, the goal of every navy was to build the biggest, most expensive ship possible. The logic was simple. A big ship can carry more guns. A big ship can carry more fuel. A big ship is a floating piece of territory that carries the flag of its country. But the Iranians had proven that being big just meant you were easier to hit. The images showed how 15 cheap boats did what the Soviet Union never could. They showed the weakness in the armor. Suddenly, every small country with a coastline realized they didn't need $1 billion to be a power. They just needed a few $100,000 and some fiberglass boats. The first thing to break in the aftermath was the insurance market. Maritime insurance is the invisible glue that holds world trade together. If an insurance company says a piece of water is a total loss zone, all trade stops. That is exactly what happened. The Strait of Hormuz was declared a dead zone by the brokers in London. For the first time in history, a small group of fast boats had successfully blockaded the entire world. They didn't need a massive fleet to do it. They just needed to prove that they could sink one ship. Once the world saw the destroyer sink, the risk became too high for anyone to ignore. The price of moving anything by sea went up by 500%. This wasn't just about oil. It was about electronics, food, and clothes. The just-in-time delivery system that the modern world relies on fell apart. Shelves in grocery stores began to empty within a week. People who had never heard of the Strait of Hormuz were now fighting over the last loaf of bread. It was a reminder that military power isn't just about winning battles. It is about keeping the world moving. When the destroyer sank, the world stopped. But there was a deeper change happening in the minds of the sailors. For decades, serving on a United States destroyer felt like being in a fortress. You felt safe behind the radar and the missiles. That feeling of safety was replaced by a constant, cold fear. Every fishing boat on the horizon now looked like a suicide threat. Every pleasure craft looked like a scout for a swarm. The Navy had to change how it talked to its own people. They stopped calling their ships platforms of power. They started calling them vulnerable assets. The shift in language reflected a shift in reality. The ocean was no longer a place where the strong could bully the weak. It was a place where the many could overwhelm the one. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological one. The world now knew that the giant had a weakness, and that weakness was made of fiberglass and outboard motors. The question for every leader was no longer, who has the biggest navy? The question was now, who can manage the most chaos? Navies began to pull their big ships away from the coasts. They moved them into the deep, open ocean where they could see for miles in every direction. The waters near the shore became no-go zones. A new kind of warfare was born overnight. The military started talking about distributed lethality. Instead of one big ship, countries started building hundreds of small, unmanned drones. They wanted their own swarms. The age of the king of the ocean was over. The ocean was now a place for the small, the fast, and the many. Sea power had been redefined in a single morning. The loss of the destroyer was a funeral for an idea. For over a century, the goal of every great navy was to build the biggest and most powerful ship possible. The logic was that a single, massive ship could control thousands of miles of ocean just by being there. But after the battle in the Strait, that logic was dead. Navies across the planet looked at the burning wreck and realized that a billion-dollar ship was a liability, not an asset. They stopped sending single ships into narrow waters almost immediately. The era of the Lone Ranger of the sea was over. If a ship had to pass through a choke point, it now traveled with a massive escort of drones and smaller vessels. But even that was just a temporary fix. The real change was much deeper and much more radical. Military leaders began to talk about something they called cloud fleets. Instead of putting all their sensors, all their missiles, and all their people on one giant target, they decided to spread them out. They started building hundreds of small, cheap, unmanned boats. Some of these boats were just floating sensors that watched the water. Some were just floating missile tubes waiting for a command. Some were designed to act as decoys to trick the enemy. None of them had a single human being on board. This meant that if an enemy launched a swarm of 15 boats, they wouldn't find a single big target to hit. They would find 100 tiny targets that were much harder to see and much harder to kill. If the enemy managed to sink 10 of these drones, it didn't matter. The rest of the cloud would just keep fighting. There was no captain to kill and no bridge to destroy. The brain of the fleet was no longer inside a single ship. It was distributed across the entire ocean in a digital network. This change wasn't just about technology. It was about the value of human to life. In the old way of thinking, losing a destroyer meant losing over 300 highly trained sailors. That is a tragedy that a nation never truly recovers from. In the new way of thinking, losing a drone is just a line on a budget report. You can build another drone in a week. You can't replace a sailor that quickly. This shift changed the very nature of deterrence. In the past, the US Navy stayed in the Persian Gulf to show that it was willing to fight. Now, they stayed to show that they couldn't be stopped. Because you can't kill a cloud. The Iranian boats found themselves in a new world where their spears were hitting ghosts. They could swarm a drone, but the drone would just call in a strike from a missile boat 50 miles away. The hunter had become the hunted. But this new world brought its own set of terrifying questions. If the ocean is filled with thousands of armed robots, who is actually in control? What happens when a drone makes a mistake and fires on a fishing boat? What happens when the network that connects the cloud gets hacked? We traded the vulnerability of the big ship for the unpredictability of the machine. The Navy of the future looks nothing like the Navy of the past. It is silent, it is invisible, and it is everywhere at once. The lone destroyer was the last of its kind. It was a beautiful, powerful relic of a time when we thought we could control the ocean with sheer size. We learned the hard way that the ocean belongs to whoever can manage the most pieces. On the board, the world watched that ship sink and saw the end of an era. But they also saw the beginning of something much more complex. The question is no longer, how do we protect the ship? The question is, how do we fight a war when there is no ship to protect? The story of the 15 boats and the lone ship teaches us 4 main lessons. First, size is not always safety. In a tight space, the many will always have an advantage over the one. It does not matter how much your ship costs if it can only look in one direction at a time. Second, high technology is a shield, but every shield has a gap. We build weapons to fight other weapons that look just like ours. When we meet something simple and cheap, our most expensive tools often fail to work. Third, the world is held together by trust, not just power. If people stop believing that the ocean is safe, the global economy can break in a single afternoon. You do not need to win a war to change the world. You only need to create enough doubt. Fourth, the future of the sea is moving away from the big and the few. The age of the floating fortress is being replaced by the age of the digital cloud. We are learning that to survive, we have to stop being a target and start being everywhere at once. This is a hypothetical scenario based on the historical record. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.